The wind had teeth that morning. It came crawling down from the mountains, biting through cotton sleeves and stirring the dry grass that clung to the edge of the Bennett ranch. The sun had barely climbed above the ridge, laying long bands of amber light across the fences, the barn, the empty yard that waited for life to begin its work again. Honora Coyle stood at the gate, her gloved hands tightening on the wood. She had walked the last 2 miles on foot after the coach wheel cracked against a rut on the road. Her dress, plain, faded blue, was the color of patience itself. Dust clung to her hem, and her bonnet string had frayed to a single thread, but she didn't care. She was here. Finally here. Ahead, the Bennett house looked sturdy and worn in all the right ways. Tin roof, smoke curling slow from the chimney. A single boot propped on the porch rail, as if someone had left it there mid-thought. When the door opened, the man who filled the frame might have been carved from the same earth that held this valley together. Colt Bennett, taller than she'd imagined, shoulders wide, hands still streaked with hay dust. His face bore the kind of calm that made people think twice before speaking. Honora drew herself upright. "Mr. Bennett," she said, voice soft but steady, "I came about the children." He regarded her, one brow tilting, unreadable. "Children? I was told you've taken in 4. I'm a teacher by trade. Reading, numbers, scripture if you like. I'm looking for work." Colt leaned a shoulder to the post. The boards creaked beneath him. "You got any of your own?" The question struck sharper than a whip crack. She looked past him, to the rocking chair, to the pair of small boots on the step, and for a heartbeat couldn't breathe. Then she answered the truth. "No, I can't have children of my own, but I'd still give everything I have to raise them right." For a long moment, only the wind spoke. Then his mouth curved. Not quite a smile, not pity either, but something plain and human. "Good," he said at last. "I've got enough kids for both of us." He stepped aside, motioning her through. They crossed the yard together, boots crunching on dry earth. Beyond the fence, 2 boys worked to guide a skittish colt toward the trough. One was tall for 10, brown-eyed and stubborn-jawed. The smaller one mimicked his brother's stance so fiercely he nearly toppled into the dust. "Eli and Finn," Colt said. "The girls are over yonder." Honora followed his gaze. Beneath the shade of the water tower, 2 little girls sat with a patchwork doll between them. One gentle-faced, maybe 7, the other, just a toddler, curls wild, cheeks smudged. When the children noticed the stranger, they froze mid-laughter. 4 pairs of eyes studied her like she was a riddle they weren't sure they wanted to solve. Honora lowered herself to one knee, smoothing her skirt. "Good morning," she said, smiling. "I'm Miss Coyle." The smallest girl blinked. "Are you the new cook?" Eli snorted. "She talks too proper for a cook." Colt shot him a look sharp enough to sand the edges off his tone. "She's here to teach," he said. That word, teach, seemed to ripple through them. The children traded glances, half hopeful, half wary. Honora reached into her satchel and pulled out a small slate. She drew the letter A with a piece of chalk worn down to a stub. "This one's my favorite," she said. "It's where every story begins." The boys leaned closer despite themselves. The toddler clapped her hands once, delighted by the white mark. Colt said nothing, but she caught the faintest flicker at the corner of his mouth, approval disguised as indifference. That evening, he showed her the room beside the kitchen. Bare walls, narrow bed, one window looking west toward the fading sun. A knitted shawl hung from a peg, half finished. The yarn was soft as breath. "Belonged to my late sister," he said quietly. "She started it for one of the little ones." Honora brushed her fingers along the stitches. "Then I'll finish it." He nodded once. "Supper's at 6. We don't ring bells here." When he left, the house exhaled into stillness. She unpacked her satchel, 3 books, a tin of tea leaves, a folded photograph of her mother, and set them neatly on the dresser. Through the thin wall she heard small voices arguing over who got the bigger biscuit, and Colt's baritone cutting through with easy command. It had been years since she'd heard a house sound that alive. Outside, twilight draped the valley in lavender. She stepped onto the porch, the air sweet with hay and the promise of rain. Colt was by the barn, lifting the smallest girl, Lahi, he'd called her, into his arms. The child's head lolled against his shoulder as sleep took her. He brushed a stray curl from her face, then carried her inside. Honora watched, hand resting lightly on the railing. The sight did something to her chest, a quiet ache, an unspoken prayer. "If there's a father like that," she murmured to the wind, "no child need ever wonder who they are." For the first time in years, she felt the faint pulse of belonging. Not because she could give life, but because she might, at last, help one keep its light. The first morning at Bennett Ranch began in hush. Not the cold kind, but the gentle quiet of a place that woke slow, like the land itself had learned to breathe before speaking. The kettle hissed on the stove when Honora came down, and beside it sat a bottle of warm milk, wrapped in a rag. No note, no signature, just thoughtfulness left in plain sight. The children appeared in fragments, Eli first, boots half-laced, and hair stubborn from sleep. Then Nora, clutching her doll, as though it were a moral obligation. Finn stumbled in last, one boot on the wrong foot, wearing yesterday's smile. They all stared at the stranger in their kitchen. "Morning," Honora offered. They mumbled something close to greeting, then disappeared behind their spoons. Colt was already gone to the barn, his absence marked by the steady rhythm of work outside, the thud of hay, the creak of saddle leather, the low hum of a man who had learned to speak through motion. By noon, the children had migrated to the yard, their play half wild, half wary. Honora followed, sitting on the steps with a small slate on her lap. She smoothed a circle in the dust with the edge of her boot and drew the letter C. "See this?" she said. "It curls like a cat's tail." Finn peeked from behind a barrel. "What's that one for?" "Corn," she said, "or Colt." That got a giggle, muffled behind his grubby hand. By the second afternoon, they'd inched closer, Eli pretending not to watch, Nora plaiting her braid into nervous loops, little Lahi pressing a finger into the dirt to trace crooked lines of her own. Honora didn't push. She simply kept drawing, humming old tunes she hadn't sung since before the war. Took her family and left her wandering the edges of other people's stories. On the third day, Colt passed through the parlor, where they sat cross-legged on the floor. He didn't stop, just paused long enough to glance at the chalk letters. "They're sittin' still," he said under his breath, almost surprised. Honora looked up. Children usually will, if they feel safe enough to learn. He nodded once, the compliment unspoken but felt. That night, the youngest girl sleepwalked. Honora found her at the foot of the stairs, eyes open but empty, lips whispering a lullaby no one else knew. She lifted the child gently, the way one gathers a secret, and carried her back to bed. The next night it happened again. So Honora stayed awake, candle burning low, humming the same tune until the child's restless breathing eased. By dawn, her fingers were stiff from holding small hands through dreams. When morning light slid through the curtains, Colt found her asleep in the chair beside the cot. He didn't wake her, just stood there for a long while, hat in hand, before heading out to the fields. Yet the days began to weave themselves into rhythm. Letters in the morning, chores at noon, stories by the hearth after supper. Honora learned the texture of the children's laughter, the bright bursts, the nervous starts. She learned that Eli lingered at the edge of every conversation like a shadow waiting to belong. That Nora pretended to be braver than she felt. That Finn sang when he was scared, and Lahi always asked for just one more story, long after sleep had claimed her. By the end of the second week, the ranch felt alive in a new way. There was the scent of bread in the kitchen again, the soft scrape of chalk on wood, the sound of someone humming while hanging laundry. One afternoon, as Honora scrubbed tin plates by the pump, she noticed Colt on the porch with a needle and thread. His big hands fumbled over a torn sleeve, the kind of job he clearly despised but refused to hand off. The shirt was Finn's. She recognized the green checks. He pricked his thumb once, muttered something rough, then tried again. Honora said nothing, just watched. "You're supposed to use smaller stitches," she said finally, voice low. He looked up, half smiling. "You offering lessons for that too?" "Maybe." He returned his attention to the cloth, the faintest grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Kid likes this shirt. I figure I ought to make it last." "You're doing fine," she said softly. "It suits him." For the first time since she'd met him, Colt laughed, a low, warm sound that didn't ask for company, but welcomed it all the same. Later that evening, after the children had drifted into dreams and the fire had dimmed to embers, Honora stepped outside. The moon hung silver and soft over the barn. She wrapped the half-finished shawl around her shoulders, feeling the old yarn give just a little under her fingers. Colt joined her a minute later, boots quiet against the porch planks. "You're good with them," he said, voice almost lost to the wind. "They make it easy." "Not always," he countered. "No," she agreed. "Not always, but worth it." He nodded, silent agreement filling the space between them. Inside, the shawl waited for its next row of stitches, and for the first time in a long while, Honora felt that maybe, just maybe, she had started to belong to something again. By late summer, the Bennett Ranch breathed like a living thing, steady, rhythmic, full of quiet purpose. The fields shimmered under a hard sun. Horses flicked their tails in slow defiance of the heat. And the laughter of children, sharp and sudden, broke across the yard like a hymn that refused to fade. Honora stood at the parlor window, sorting through dog-eared books. Dust swirled in golden threads as she stacked them neatly beside a basket of mended clothes. The house, once silent, now hummed with life again. Then a cry shattered it. "Colt!" The voice, high, frightened, came from outside. Honora dropped the books and ran, skirts gathering dust. Near the west fence, Nora lay crumpled at the base of a post, her small hand clutching her arm. Colt was already there, his voice trembling in a way she'd never heard before. "Don't move, baby. Don't move." Honora dropped to her knees beside them, Nora's arm was twisted wrong, her face white as linen, her lips trembling from trying not to cry. "Let me see," Honora said. She was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that came from surviving worse. Colt hesitated, hands hovering, helpless. "She fell. She was just... Fetch me 2 straight pieces of..." "Wood," Honora said, her tone brisk, unshaken. "Now!" He blinked, then moved, snapping off 2 slats from the fence, splinters flying. Honora tore her own apron into strips, set the splints along Nora's arm, and tied them tight. "It's going to hurt, sweetheart," she whispered, "but you're brave. I can see it." Nora bit her lip until it bled, nodding through tears. When the makeshift bandage was secure, Honora brushed a strand of hair from the girl's face and exhaled slowly. "There," she murmured. "It's done." Colt knelt across from her, hands trembling. His eyes didn't leave Nora, but his voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "I've never seen someone who wasn't a mother," he said quietly, "be so much like one." Honora looked at him, the weight of his words catching her breath. "A mother isn't made in the body," she said softly. "She's made in the choosing." They carried Nora inside together, Colt holding her carefully, Honora walking beside them, whispering comfort with every step. That night, when the child finally slept, Honora stayed by her bedside, wiping her brow, humming a lullaby. Colt stood in the doorway for a long time, the lamplight catching the weary lines of his face. When he turned away, she thought she saw him reach up and brush his eyes. Days passed. Nora healed slowly, her arm bound in neat white cloth. Life at the ranch fell back into rhythm. But something between Colt and Honora had shifted, something wordless but constant. They began to share small silences at the end of each day. He'd leave a cup of coffee by her elbow when she taught on the porch. She'd set aside his portion of supper, even when he came in after dark. The warmth between them wasn't sudden. It was steady, quiet, built one unspoken kindness at a time. Then one morning, a rider appeared. Dust rose behind him as he crossed the pasture, a man in a dark coat with papers in his saddlebag. He dismounted with a practiced authority that made Honora's stomach twist. Colt met him halfway, his shadow stretching long in the noon sun. "Mr. Bennett," the man said, tipping his hat. "I'm with the Territorial Welfare Office. There's been concern." Colt's face didn't change, but the air seemed to grow colder. "About what?" The man unfolded a set of papers, the official seal catching the light. "You're caring for 4 minors. None are registered as kin. No guardianship records. According to county law, they're to be transferred to the Cheyenne orphanage in 10 days. For a second, no one moved. Then Honora stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "There must be some mistake," she said. "These children belong here." The man's eyes were sympathetic but firm. "Ma'am, the law's the law. We'll return with escort on the 10th day." He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving a trail of dust that felt like finality. Colt stood there, still as stone, the notice crumpled in his fist. That evening, Honora found him on the porch, hat on his knee, staring at the dying sun. She sat beside him in silence until the light faded to blue. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw. "They're not mine, not by blood. Eli I found after a barn fire. Nora, left on a church step. Finn's ma died in the fever last spring. And Lahi, her pa was hanged for horse theft when she was 2 months old." He took a long breath. "I can't make a family the way others do, but I figured I could be a place to land." Honora reached over, covering his calloused hand with her own. "You became that," she said quietly. "More than most ever try." He looked at her, the pain in his eyes plain as daylight. "They'll take them, won't they?" She straightened, fire in her chest. "Not if I have breath left to fight it." That night, the ranch was quiet but uneasy. The children whispered behind doors, their voices full of fear. At supper, Finn asked softly, "Are they gonna send us away?" Honora knelt beside him, her voice steady. "No one's sending you anywhere, sweetheart." "But that man said—" "Sometimes," she said, tucking a lock of hair behind his ear. "The people with the loudest papers know the least about love." She smiled. "And sometimes we just have to remind them what family really means." In the nights that followed, Honora wrote letters, one to the preacher, one to the schoolhouse, one to the doctor in town who'd once treated Lahi's fever. Quietly, steadily, word began to spread. Neighbors stopped by with small kindnesses, bread, milk, a signature on a petition. And while the fear still sat heavy in the house, something stronger took root beneath it. Faith, stubborn and slow-growing, like grass after drought. Honora had come to teach. But now she found herself fighting for the only classroom that had ever mattered, a home. The wind came first, low, restless, and wild, dragging dust across the valley like some spirit too old to settle. By sundown, clouds stacked thick above the ridge, bruised purple and gray. The Bennett Ranch braced for what was coming. Honora had lit every lantern in the house. Their glow wavered against the walls, trembling with the wind's breath. In her arms, little Lahi burned with fever, her curls damp against Honora's sleeve. The child whimpered in half-sleep, one small hand clutching the collar of Honora's dress. Colt stood in the doorway, soaked from his last dash to the barn, his face cut with worry. Outside, the rain began in earnest, thick, slanting sheets that blurred the world to gray. "Her fever's rising fast," Honora said, voice breaking. He nodded once. "I can ride." "Colt, no." She rose halfway, clutching the child tighter. "The river's near over. A freight wagon was swept clean off that bridge last week." "I know." His voice was steady but carved with iron. "Doctor keeps a spare kit in his barn. I can reach it." "You'll drown." Her words cracked, sharp as the thunder that rolled across the hills. "Or worse. You'll get there and won't make it back." Colt crossed to her, kneeling beside the hearth. He rested one calloused hand on Lahi's back, the other on Honora's shoulder. His eyes, when they met hers, were steady and final. "You can take care of all four better than I ever could," he said softly. "But this is mine to do." Honora's throat closed. The rain pounded harder against the windows, 1,000 fists demanding to be heard. She wanted to argue, to beg, but words wouldn't come. So she just reached for his hand and held it tight. The moment stretched, long, fragile, sacred. Then he was up, pulling on his oilskin coat, tying the flap under his chin. He grabbed a lantern, a rope, his hat, and was gone before she could breathe another protest. The door slammed open, then shut, leaving only the echo of hoofbeats and the roar of the storm. Untamed turned heavy after that. Honora sat by the hearth, sponging Lahi's skin with ginger water, whispering songs that cracked halfway through. Nora knelt beside her, holding fresh rags. Finn sat motionless on the stairs, wide-eyed. Eli paced the room like a caged colt, fists tight at his sides. Outside, thunder growled low, rolling over the roof. At one point, Finn whispered, "Is Pa coming back?" Honora gathered him close, her voice trembling but sure. "If it's for one of you," she said, "he'd ride through anything." Hours passed. The storm did not let go. The house creaked and moaned. Rain lashed the windows until they sang. Somewhere near midnight, the lantern by the door sputtered out. Then, hoofbeats. Faint at first, then louder. 2 sets. Honora bolted upright. Heart pounding, she flung the door open into a wall of rain and wind. There he was, Colt Bennett, drenched to the bone, pale as the lightning behind him, dragging a second horse behind. A man clung to that horse's saddle, gripping a doctor's bag. "Got him!" Colt gasped, stumbling forward. "Got the kit, too." Honora caught his arm before he fell, pulling him inside. The doctor followed, shaking like a leaf, his eyes darting to the feverish child on the couch. "Blankets," Honora said. "Now." Between the two of them, they worked fast, mixing tinctures, cooling her head, forcing drops of medicine past trembling lips. The night crawled toward morning, one shallow breath at a time. At last, as the first gray light crept through the curtains, Lahi's fever broke. Her little chest rose, fell, rose again, steady, quiet, living. Honora slumped in her chair, tears slipping down her cheeks. She didn't care who saw. Colt sat in the corner, boots still wet, coat half off, fast asleep with his hat tipped low. The firelight painted him gold, softening the lines of his face. She watched him for a long moment, gratitude and something deeper tightening in her chest. Just after sunrise, there came a knock on the door. 2 men from the county stood outside, hats in hand, boots too clean for ranch work. "Mr. Bennett," one said, holding a sealed envelope, "we've received your petition. Community testimony came in strong, especially from Miss Coyle." Colt blinked, still shaking off sleep. "And?" The man smiled faintly. "The removal orders rescinded pending final approval. The children stay." Honora froze, hand to her mouth. Behind her, small footsteps approached, the children listening from the hallway. "Are we staying?" Finn asked, eyes wide. Honora knelt, pulling him into her arms. "Yes, sweetheart, you're home." Behind her, Colt exhaled, slow and deep, the sound of a man who'd carried too much weight for too long and was finally allowed to set it down. The storm outside faded to a drizzle, soft and steady. The world smelled new again, mud and pine and second chances. Honora stood, looking at Colt. He gave her a small, tired smile, the kind that spoke without words. The hardest part was over, but something in both of them knew this was not an ending. Only the place where love begins to take root, quiet and strong, like grass after rain. Winter came early that year. It rolled down the mountains like a slow white tide, swallowing the valley and leaving only silence in its wake. The fields froze before the last pumpkins had been gathered, and snow piled high against the barn doors. Inside the Bennett house, firelight painted the walls gold. Honora stirred stew over the stove, while Colt mended a saddle strap by the hearth. The children sat in a heap of quilts, Nora reading aloud in halting rhythm, as Finn followed each word with his finger. Eli listened quietly, pretending not to care, and little Lahi slept with her thumb tucked in her fist. It was a rare calm, the kind that comes when a family learns how to breathe together. The peace didn't last. Colt stood at the doorway one morning, scarf wound tight, saddlebag slung over his shoulder. "Town's running low," he said, Olson's got feed, and the mail's been waiting 3 weeks. I'll bring it all back." Eli, too, grown to be told no, stepped forward. "I'm coming." Colt studied him a long moment. 2 days. We ride light and fast." Honora didn't argue. She simply handed Colt a wrapped bundle of bread and jerky, her fingers brushing his glove. "Be careful," she whispered. He smiled, faint but sure. "Always." Then they rode off, into a world that had turned to glass and shadow. By the second day, the wind sharpened. By the third, the sky turned a color that meant trouble. Honora's hands were red and raw from chopping wood. The children were restless, watching the horizon for riders who did not come. That night, when she tucked them in, Finn asked in a whisper, "You think they're okay?" Honora forced a smile. "Your pa's too stubborn to let a storm beat him." But when the lamps went out, she stayed awake by the fire, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken since before her own child was taken by fever. Sometime before dawn, she heard it. Faint hoofbeats, unsteady and broken. She flew to the door. Colt stumbled in first, dragging a half-frozen Eli behind him. Both were soaked, blue-lipped, shaking from cold. "God above!" Honora gasped. "Get inside, now!" She pulled them to the hearth, stripping off coats, boots, gloves, anything soaked through. She rubbed warmth back into their hands, forced broth between their lips. Eli's eyelids fluttered. "Sorry," he murmured. "Horse fell." "Hush now," Honora whispered. "You're safe. You're home." When the boy's breathing finally steadied, she looked up at Colt. He stood by the fire, steam rising off his shoulders, eyes fixed on her face. "You scared me," she said, voice shaking. He stepped closer. "I'm sorry." She turned away, pressing a fist to her mouth. "I thought I lost you." His hand came to rest on her shoulder, gentle and firm. "I've never had a place to come back to," he said softly. "Not really. Not until you." She faced him, eyes wet but unflinching. "And I never thought I could be chosen again," she whispered. "Not after losing my boy. But when you look at me like that." He took another step. The fire crackled between them. "You said once you couldn't have children," he murmured. "But you've been a mother in every way that matters." He swallowed hard. "I don't want you to just teach them, Honora. I want you to raise them with me, as their mother, and as my wife." For a moment the world stopped. The firelight flickered across his face, honest and worn. Honora's breath hitched. Tears welled and spilled freely now, her voice trembling. "Colt." He shook his head gently. "No fancy words. No preacher needed tonight. Just yes or no." Her answer came in silence, one small nod, trembling but certain. Colt stepped forward, wrapped her in his arms, and held her close. There were no fireworks, no grand declarations, only the hush of snow outside, and the sound of two hearts finally at rest. For the first time in years, she cried not from loss, but from love. Spring arrived like an apology. The land softened, the fields bloomed, and laughter once again filled the yard. Beneath the old oak tree, white chairs were lined in rows. The preacher from town stood ready. A handful of neighbors gathered near. Honora's dress was cream, simple and graceful. Her hair was pinned back, a few strands catching in the breeze. Nora tucked wildflowers into her sash, while little Lahi wore a crown of daisies. At the front, Colt waited, his vest pressed, boots shined, eyes bright. When Honora walked toward him, Eli on one side, Finn on the other, the crowd fell silent. Colt took her hands in his, rough palms against silk. "I can't promise riches," he said, voice thick but steady. "But I promise this. Every morning you wake, you'll know you're needed here. Wanted. Loved." Honora didn't speak. She simply smiled, and that was answer enough. The preacher said the words. The rings were slipped on, and the valley caught its breath. When Colt kissed her, the children whooped and cheered, and someone from town started crying into their hat. It wasn't grand. It was perfect. In the weeks that followed, the ranch changed, not because of what was built, but because of what was shared. Honora began teaching the neighbor children under the oak tree, chalkboard propped on 2 barrels. Colt repaired saddles for trade and welcomed every stray dog and wandering soul that found its way up the road. Eli learned the hammer, Nora the ledger, Finn the fiddle, and Lahi the art of laughter itself. One golden afternoon, Honora sat on the porch with a book in her lap, watching Colt and Eli mend a bridle in the yard. The light caught Colt's hair, and she thought, "This is what home feels like." She whispered to herself, "I used to think my life had ended. Turns out it was only waiting to begin." Colt looked up, catching her gaze. Without setting down the leather strap, he said quietly, "You're not just their mother, Honora. You're the mother of this whole home." She blinked back tears, smiling through them, because love didn't need to be spoken anymore. It just needed living. The wind swept soft across the fields, carrying laughter and the scent of lilac. Somewhere in that wide Wyoming sky, the ghosts of their old loneliness drifted away, leaving behind only warmth. And on that porch, beneath the endless blue, a woman who once believed she could never belong, and a man who thought he never would again, found forever in each other's silence. Spring lingered long on the Bennett Ranch that year. The river ran clear again, the meadows thick with wild iris and bluebonnet. The storms were only memories now, soft ghosts that lived in the sound of wind through the cottonwoods. Honora moved through the house with an ease that only comes when every wall knows your heartbeat. The kitchen smelled of bread and lilac soap. The laughter of children drifted through open windows, blending with the low hum of bees beyond the porch. Colt still rose before dawn, boots whispering across the floorboards, kettle already hissing on the stove. But now there was a second mug waiting beside his, small, porcelain, chipped on one edge, hers. Their lives had become a language of quiet habits. His coat on her peg, her mending by his chair, the half-finished shawl that now covered Lahi when she napped. Out back, beneath the oak tree that had watched every season pass, Honora taught a small circle of neighborhood children. Chalk dust clung to her skirt, and the sound of recited letters mingled with birdsong. Sometimes Colt would pause mid-task, leaning on the fence to listen, pretending not to smile. One evening, as the sun sank low, painting the sky the color of honey, Honora closed her lesson book and walked to the porch. Colt sat there whittling a piece of pine into the shape of a bird. "Looks like freedom," she said. He glanced up. "Nah," he murmured. "Looks like home." She laughed softly, taking the carving from his hand. "Same thing, isn't it?" He didn't answer, just reached out, threading his rough fingers through hers. They sat like that for a long while, the silence between them rich and full, the kind that needed no words. The children chased fireflies in the yard, their laughter echoing across the fields. From somewhere down the road came the sound of a fiddle, faint and sweet. Life had found its rhythm again. Honora watched the horizon fade into starlight and thought of the woman she once was, the one who stood at a gate with nothing left to give but hope. Now she had a family born not of blood, but of choice. And that, she realized, was the purest kind of kinship there was. If this story warmed your heart, subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, where every tale rides home on love's horizon.